Before we start, please hear a message from International News Today Network. Starting today, for every subscriber, International News Today Network will plant one tree to save our planet. Please help contribute in saving our planet by subscribing to our channel. One subscriber equals one tree. Thanks.
"60 years ago, there was only one person who could ride out of the Kremlin's Spasskaya Tower gate in an armored ZIS-115 Soviet limousine. He had power that any emperor would envy. This car belonged to Joseph Stalin. Driving home from work was no simple affair for the leader. Stalin used to sit on a special converted seat, protected by guards on each side. He trusted no one. The Soviet leader strictly instructed the driver which way to go, meaning the car would often turn abruptly from the wide avenues onto Moscow's side streets, weaving a long and confusing route.
He was ready to kill people, and he did kill them. And if he could do it, he thought they could also act this way. And that idea scared him to death.
Stalin's limousine eventually reached a narrow and strictly guarded highway. Many years ago, nobody was allowed here. Local residents had no clue that it hid a facility known only to top officials. This is the Kuntsevo country house, Stalin's personal residence. Even though 60 years have passed since the death of the Soviet leader, Kuntsevo has remained top secret. Filming has only been allowed here on rare occasions. Stalin spent his last 20 years in Kuntsevo, right up to his death. Historians still puzzle over his mysterious demise. Did he die a natural death, or was someone else involved?
He's upstairs with our family whore.
It's not appropriate to talk about one's bride like that. Whoever's bride she is, I raised her, and so on and so forth. Let's at least do the first piece.
Theatre director Alexander Podonsky has frequently been offered the role of Stalin, and he's flatly refused every time. He prefers to work with the classics, looking for parallels with the time of Stalinism.
You're so full of it. I can't understand how he can love any of you.
All his life, he has avoided mentioning Stalin in relation to himself. Few people know that Alexander Berdonsky is not just a theatre director. He's also Joseph Stalin's grandson.
Well, yes, there was Stalin. But for me, just for like any ordinary man, he was up there. I had nothing to do with him. I saw him during the May and November parade. I looked at him from the stands. I only saw him close at the pillar hall of the House of the Unions, where he was lying in state.
In March 1953, the Soviet people bid farewell to Stalin. For 3 days, an endless stream of mourners came to see him lying in state. The first to shout claims that Stalin had been murdered was his son, Vasily. Stalin's circle would not forget the outburst and would soon try to get rid of him. But before doing so, a magnificent funeral was organized for the former leader. Many died in the crush as crowds lined up to see his coffin.
It is impossible to express the grief our party and the people of our country are suffering.
For many years, the Soviet people were led to believe that Stalin had died in his Kremlin apartment, while his country house remained a secret. Only Stalin's inner circle was aware of the circumstances around his death. The leader's descendants have only been able to come here after 60 years. Alexander Berdonsky and Stepan Mikoyan have not seen each other for many years. Stepan is the son of Stalin's closest colleague, Anastas Mikoyan. For the first time, they were invited to Stalin's country house to see with their own eyes where he lived and died.
Good day to you.
Hello.
Glad to see you here. Have you been here before?
Many years ago.
I've never been here. My father used to be here quite often.
Showing them around Stalin's residence is historian Sergei Devyatov. He co-wrote a book about Kuntsevo and knows the place like the back of his hand.
I now understand why Stalin had given the order not to clean away the snow under the windows. He wanted to be able to see footprints, as the windowsills were very low.
There were no such instructions.
Well, he could have merely said it.
Well, actually, all his words were written down as a rule. Let's start our tour. Let's begin with the small dining room.
Stalin was particularly fond of this room, which doubled as his study. There's a fireplace here. Stalin enjoyed spending time in front of it on long winter evenings. A hunting rifle sat close by, as Stalin loved to shoot and scare away the crows. On the first spring night of 1953, he decided to sleep in this very room. The leader was so terrified of assassination attempts that he had several beds prepared for him around the house. Not even his bodyguards knew where he would sleep each night, a decision that was to prove fatal.
He always slept on different couches. He put a chair and a lamp next to the couch where he was going to sleep, as he usually read a book before falling asleep.
On that night, Stalin went to bed at about 4 in the morning. He had stayed up late with guests from his closest circle. Nightly feasts were a regular affair. The bodyguards knew that their master would not be up before noon. But at midday, the bell in Stalin's room remained suspiciously silent. By 3 p.m., he still had not emerged. Bodyguards weren't allowed to call on him uninvited. That was strictly prohibited. Later in the afternoon, duty officers became seriously concerned. Only by 7 o'clock in the evening, having received a letter from the Kremlin, did the officer on duty decide to take it to Stalin. He found the Soviet leader in the doorway of the next room, lying unconscious on the floor.
This is where he was found, on this carpet, between the table and the couch. It is still unclear what happened. There was a glass of mineral water here. Stalin was lying there. Most likely he stood up and failed to get to the couch.
Stalin had suffered a massive stroke, and there was no one close by to give him aid. There were soon rumors that Stalin had not just died, but was murdered.
When a tyrant of such caliber dies, these kinds of assumptions are always made. When a tyrant lives behind high walls, there is always the feeling that his own circle might plot against him.
Stalin's worst fears of conspiracies and assassination may have come to pass with his sudden death. He distrusted the people close to him so much that he fired his bodyguard, Nikolai Vlasik, who had headed his security service for 20 years and was one of his most loyal and reliable people. Shortly after his dismissal, Vlasik ended up in jail.
The official reason for Vlasik's imprisonment was that he misbehaved and fooled around at the expense of the state, but Stalin never blamed anyone for that. He decided to get rid of him because Vlasik had held office for too long and had become unreliable.
Vlasik would stand beside the leader during all public occasions. He was a general who had finished only 3 classes of secondary school and had been decorated without having performed a single feat. Stalin never knew that his personal bodyguard kept a secret diary of his time with the leader. No one else dared do so, as Stalin himself would decide how and by whom he would be remembered in history. For many years, Vlasic's unique record of the Stalin era was classified. Just recently has it been made available to the general public. It's the only unofficial testimony of a man who had been with Stalin all the time.
He used to wear an old, shabby coat. I offered his wife, Nadezhda, to make him a new one, but she needed to take his measurements to do so. Or she could have taken his old coat and made a new one of the same size at the tailor's. She failed to take his measurements, as he flatly refused to say he needed a new coat. But we still managed to make him a new coat. We changed it for a new one when the chance arose. Stalin pretended that he hadn't noticed a thing.
Vlasic protected Stalin and was by his side for 20 years. And, of course, he was deeply attached to Stalin.
In the evenings when we were on vacation, we always had dinner together with Secretary Poskrebyshev and Stalin. Joseph Vissarionovich joked a lot and shared his memories from his past. He told us about his life in exile in the Turahansk region. Those hours of leisure spent together with the leader will always remain the best hours of my life. He was so likable, I always felt easy and free together with him.
The diaries produced the impression that Vlasic, like many other people, formed an impaired judgment of what was going on. Instead of taking a critical view of the situation, his mind was obscured with the ideology finely crafted by the leader.
Vlasic was the only person allowed to take pictures of Stalin and his family at their country retreat. In these photographs, Stalin is not the grand figure of a propaganda poster, but an ordinary man spending time with his family. In the 1930s, he trusted Vlasic implicitly, even allowing him to look after his children. But then a great tragedy struck, from which he would never recover. Alexander Budansky visits the Novodevichy Cemetery in Moscow every year. Here, the Soviet and Russian elites, such as author Nikolai Gogol and Boris Yeltsin, are buried. The grave of Stalin's wife and Alexander's grandmother, Nadezhda Alliluyeva, is also here.
Do you know the story of the monument? Do you know why her hand is in that position? A very talented sculptor, Shadar, made this monument. That's how he depicted the hand of someone who takes their own life.
On the night of November the 9th, 1932, Stalin's second wife, Nadezhda Alliluyeva, shot herself after a fight with her husband. Stalin did not attend the funeral.
I think she had no other way out. There was no way she could escape Stalin. And she knew what a blow it was going to be for him. That's why she did it. I think that he did have a sense of guilt. He may have blamed the circumstances and her nature, but he certainly did have a sense of indirect guilt.
The man who was said to have a heart of steel hardened even more. Just a few years later, the country was swept by a wave of repression, taking with it the old Bolsheviks, the cream of the intelligentsia, generals of the armed forces, and all surviving relatives of both Stalin's wives. After Nadezhda's death, Stalin would never marry again.
Well, he believed that she betrayed him. Well, it's human not to blame oneself.
He distanced himself from his children and moved to the Kuntsevo country residence, leaving his daughter and son at his former home with a babysitter and Nikolai Vlasic, his chief of security.
Stalin was deep in grief after his wife's death, who was also his dear friend. His children were little at that time. Being a very busy person, Stalin could not afford to give them a lot of attention. So he had to entrust the upbringing of his kids to housekeeper Karolina. She was a well-bred woman who was very fond of his children. When both of them grew up and started school, part of the responsibility for them also fell on me.
He sank into solitude. Deep in his heart, he was lonely even before that, just like any person striving for power. But after his wife's death, he became lonely in every sense of the word. No one could ever replace his wife. He went to bed later and later every night, inviting people round to keep him company.
Before his wife's death, Stalin's inner circle used to visit him with their own wives. But after Nadezhda Alliluyeva passed away, it became a men-only affair. The large dining room in the Kuntsevo country house was the center of the famous night feasts. Stalin made his guests dance. The dining room still has the gramophone presented to him by Churchill, on which Stalin played the records of his favorite songs. He was taken there from the small dining room after his stroke.
An improvised medical center was organized here. People were trying to figure out what to do. By the 3rd of March, it was clear that his brain had suffered irreversible damage.
Doctors came to Stalin's bedside too late. At least 12 hours had passed before the unconscious leader was found. When the guards reported that Stalin was on his deathbed, those closest to him were too afraid to go to his country home.
The Minister of State Security, Semyon Ignatiev, was scared to enter when he arrived. The Minister of State Security, someone that everyone in the country feared, was too afraid to come in. He imagined he would see Stalin sick in his bed. He'd open his eyes, look at him, and say, "Why are you here?"
One of the most sinister figures of Stalin's inner circle turned out to be brave enough, Lavrentiy Beria. He knew too well that all of his Ministry of State Security predecessors had ended up in front of a firing squad. He also fell out of Stalin's favor and was very likely to be arrested soon. His supporters were also being prosecuted.
Beria was the one who understood the situation in the higher echelons of power, so he could not allow this to happen. Moreover, my grandfather told me that Beria had even boasted that it was him who was responsible for Stalin's death. Beria used to say that he saved everyone from the repressions by the unpredictable, insane dictator.
Beria immediately realized just how serious Stalin's condition was, but he barred doctors from being called and left.
The most dangerous thing was the fact that there was a traitor among the people close to Stalin. It was Beria. He was an experienced and cunning enemy who cleverly disguised his motives, and Stalin trusted him. That was his big mistake. Beria had long been striving for power and resorted to all possible ways one could think of. He was capable of anything.
It was not just Beria, but every one of Stalin's associates who had reason to see his demise. Vyacheslav Molotov and Anastas Mikoyan were particularly fearful of arrest. Stalin, terrified of conspiracy against him, decided to completely restructure his circle, and at the same time to intimidate the people of his country once again.
Our families, friends, colleagues, hundreds of people could have been affected. Now it is even hard to imagine that it could really be the case. When he was given a list of women, not the enemies of the people, but their wives, he easily signed that list and ordered them all to be shot. How could a person be so cruel?
Vyacheslav Molotov, the man who'd signed the secret protocol on the division of Europe with the Nazis, had further reason to hate the head of state. Stalin had sent his wife, Polina Zhemchuzhina, to a gulag. Molotov himself was deprived of any real power, and preparations were already being made for his arrest. Molotov's grandson owes his own birth to Stalin's death.
Both Molotov and Zhemchuzhina were great at surviving. When they saw the first signs that my grandmother was going to be arrested soon, they came up with a plan. They got divorced and parted ways. It was their only chance for survival. And the plan worked. That's how my mother stayed alive and gave birth to me.
Many people surrounding Stalin had motive for murdering him. However, some didn't have the courage, while others lacked the opportunity. Stalin always replaced people in his cabinet before they had the chance to hatch a plot. The leader deprived himself of family, friends, and relatives. He replaced them with senior party members who were very much afraid of him.
As he died, suddenly it seemed to them that he had opened his eyes and raised his hand. So they kneeled down in fear immediately. They thought he would ask them why they had gathered at his bedside. Stalin had fallen victim to the very system he had built, in which everyone was mortally afraid of him, including the people closest to him.
While Stalin teetered between life and death, those around him were already dividing up power. Stalin fought the inevitable for 4 days. The Soviet leader was pronounced dead on March the 5th, 1953.
This is the couch that Stalin died on.
Didn't you mean there?
No, the doctors asked to move him here, and that's where he died.
By the end of his life, Stalin's children had become a disappointment to him. His daughter Svetlana was married twice. Both were unsuccessful. Stalin did not approve of either of her husbands, and she left for the United States and died in a retirement home all alone. His son Vasily had a drinking problem. His grandson Alexander Berdyansky chose to take his mother's maiden name rather than bearing that of the steel-hearted Soviet leader.
I can't say that I loved my father. I was afraid of him. It was the greatest feeling I had towards him. I hated it when he took us to some party together with him or wanted us to do some sports. The farther from us, the better. I never loved him. He was often drunk. I didn't understand it then. When he was drunk, he was a very difficult and unpleasant man.
Vasily Stalin was called the first Soviet prince for a reason. At the age of 21, he became an Air Force colonel, commander of a military aviation regiment. At 26, he commanded the Moscow Aviation District. At 29, he was made lieutenant general. After his father's death, Vasily Stalin was stripped of his rank and awards. A month later, he was arrested and sentenced to 8 years in jail. The once powerful Soviet prince was hidden behind bars in solitary confinement under the false name of Vasilyev. After serving his term, he was sent into exile in Kazan. 1 year later, he died.
For years, I couldn't forgive him many things. I couldn't forgive him for what he'd done to my mother. I couldn't forgive him the horrible childhood my sister and I had had. But as I grew older, now I feel very sorry for him, because he was a very talented person with a crippled life.
Stalin died alone in a huge, empty house. There was no one there save for the servants and bodyguards. He had eliminated everyone who was loyal to him. People who had helped him with the revolution and with his repression. People who had gathered at his home for holidays. The pictures of children on his walls had been cut from magazines, just as his own sons and daughter had been cut from his life. His inner circle became his family. The Kuntsevo country house was his new Kremlin.
We don't know how it might feel to be in Stalin's shoes. Many think about it, but I think it's ridiculous. Because no one has ever found themselves in such a position. Not even a single Russian emperor. This is loneliness. This is the tragedy of solitude.
Even though Stalin lived for a short while after his stroke, his inner circle had already betrayed him. Historians believe that they deliberately prevented the doctors from attending to Stalin. Whether or not he could have recovered if help had been offered immediately remains a question no one can answer.
It is curious that there is an assumption that Stalin's close associates from the Central Committee Presidium and Soviet leaders were criminals who could easily kill their chief. This is very interesting, and no one doubted it.
Stalin's death put an end to the repression. Just a few days after his funeral, the rehabilitation of Stalin's victims began. In the past 60 years, more than 10 million people have been rehabilitated. While many had been terrified under Stalin's rule, there were still some who loved him. After being released from prison, his former personal bodyguard, Nikolai Vlasic, continued to write his diary.
I was badly hurt by Stalin. After 25 years of excellent work without making a single mistake, receiving only rewards and acknowledgements, I was thrown into jail. Despite my endless devotion, he threw me into the hands of enemies. But never, not a single minute in my life, no matter what state I was in, did I have a grudge against Stalin.